All right, this PowerPoint presentation will correspond with Chapter 5 if you're using the Essentials textbook, or Chapter 13 and 14 if you are using the Explorations free textbook. Chapter 5 will go over the concept of race and whether or not it's a valid, biologically meaningful concept, and we will also go into human adaptation. First, we should establish that race is the classification or attempt to classify human variation. Early written records do not actually use this idea. Some argue that the race concept started during the Renaissance, began with Linnaeus and taxonomy. If you recall from back in Chapter 2 and 3, we talked about Linnaeus and how he attempted to classify biological organisms into a genus and species. The only problem with this is with anatomically modern Homo sapiens, there's really not a way to classify us any further than just Homo sapiens. There is no genetic or biologically valid way to classify or subdivide them any further. Other early race concepts began in the 18th century. A scientist by the name of Blumenbach studied a set of skulls and attempted to set a racial taxonomy. Blumenbach assumed that racial categories that he established would be static, meaning they would remain the same. But as we've learned through gene flow, humans are interbreeding and their genes are flowing between many different ancestries. So racial categories, even if they were valid, would not be static. Anthropologists have worked to debunk the race concept, or at least the idea that it's racially that race is a biologically valid or genetically valid category. Franz Baum, who's sometimes considered to be the father of modern anthropology, was among the first to challenge the concept or the idea that we could classify or add taxonomy to human variation. So Boas also examined measurements of the skull. So he examined what's called the cephalic index. And this is measurements of cranial breadth and cranial length that gives you a cranial index. And he found no support of racial types. This work was a foundation for a focus on biological processes rather than typology. So looking at modern human variations as adaptations to the environment. So we'll explore that more in this lecture. Any variations that you see in the pigment in one's skin, how tall somebody is, the shape of their hair, the color of their hair, the color of their eyes, the shape of their eyes. All of this variation can be pretty easily explained as adaptations to local environments. And Franz Baum found that there was just as much variation within a so-called race as between. So these so-called racial traits are what we call nonconcordant, meaning that there's no genetic or biological validity to them. A geneticist by the name of Robert Lewontin studied global genetic variation, and he found that these so-called racial groups only accounted for about 5 to 10% of the genetic variation among humans. Homo sapiens in general, we are all 99.9% identical. Of course, we vary at some genetic locuses. There are genes that code for the amount of melanin in our skin and the type of melanin. There are genes that code for our hair color and eye color. But this variation does not lead to much genotypic variation between our species. Most variation is actually among groups, not within them. And since Lewontin's research, a number of other genetic studies have reached the same exact conclusion. So if we shouldn't use race, what should we use? So we can look at skin color as climate adaptation, more specifically adaptations to variations in UV exposure. So quite simply, if your ancestors originated near the equator, so essentially in the dark orange areas here, it is likely that you have more dark melanin in your skin. Dark melanin is called eumelanin, the lighter melanin is called pheomelanin. So if you can trace your ancestry or most of your ancestry back to the equator, then it's likely that you have more dark melanin in your skin. And then if you can trace your ancestry to near the poles, so the blue, purple, and yellow areas, it's likely that you have more of the pheomelanin, more of the light-colored skin. So melanin is a pigment that is essentially the natural sunscreen. It will protect your skin from UV damage. And we'll look at beyond that, this melanin will also protect essential vitamins from degrading within your body, specifically folate. So if we shouldn't use racial categories, geographical clines would be a more appropriate or biologically valid way to classify the variation in skin tones. So specific biological traits follow a geographical gradient or a cline. Skin pigmentation is an excellent example of this. So again, if you're tracing your ancestry near the equator, it's likely that you have more dark melanin. And as you move upwards towards the poles, upwards or downwards towards the poles, the skin tone becomes lighter and lighter to allow for adequate vitamin D absorption. So melanin is the primary influence on vitamin D synthesis. So if your ancestors lived in a region that did not have high UV exposure, it's likely that you have more of the pheomelanin. You have a lighter skin tone because your body needs to utilize that UV radiation in order to synthesize vitamin D. So depending on the environment, a person's melanin can either be advantageous or disadvantageous. So if you have lighter skin, it could potentially be disadvantageous for you to live in an area with high UV exposure. But of course, we have cultural ways of adapting to this as well. We can wear clothing to protect our skin. We can wear sunscreen to protect our skin. We can use the knowledge that we shouldn't be outside for long periods of time without skin protection. And then in contrast, if you have darker melanin, it can be disadvantageous to live near the poles where there's lower UV exposure. If you have too much dark melanin, then your body may struggle with vitamin D absorption, which can have impacts on your bones. Vitamin D is critical in bone development. So the body needs UV radiation to synthesize vitamin D. So that's why if you live near the poles or your ancestors live near the poles, it is likely that you have more of the pheomelanin. Vitamin D is extremely crucial in calcium absorption and also bone mineralization. And deficiencies in vitamin D can lead to malformations of the pelvis and of other bones as well. Rickets is a disorder that's fairly common if you happen to have high levels of the darker melanin and you're not getting adequate vitamin D. But of course, we also have cultural ways of avoiding this as well. We can use supplements and sun lamps, things like that, to make sure that you're getting adequate vitamin D. This HHMI clip is one of your required film clips for this week. So this is called HHMI, the Biology of Skin Color. So there's a couple study questions for you to look at here. What are the two types of melanin? So there's going to be eumelanin and pheomelanin. It's also going to talk about NASA, so I don't want to give too much away, but NASA is going to be involved in this film clip. Also looking at how folate is involved. Folate is a B vitamin that is considered to be biological gold in the sense of folate is crucial and critical for the development of a healthy fetus and also for sperm production. So melanin not only protects your skin from things like skin cancer and UV radiation damage, it also protects folate from degrading within your body, which could potentially influence your reproductive success. And thinking back to what we already know about evolution, if it influences individual and or reproductive success, that is a trait or a feature that is going to be influenced by the forces of evolution. All right, so these next few slides are going to look at the stages of the human growth cycle. So the stages are going to be divided into 3 predominant stages. The prenatal stage is conception through birth, so zygote formation once the sperm fertilizes the egg, and then all the way until that baby is born. So in humans, typically about 9 months. And then the second phase is called the postnatal, so that goes all the way from birth until adolescence. So age 0 all the way through 12 or 13. And then the adult stage goes all the way from adolescence through death, essentially. Senescence is the aging process. We'll talk about senescence here a little bit more in a moment. All right, let's look a little bit more closely at each stage. So during the prenatal stage, so that's all the way from conception until birth, that developing fetus is going to be extremely sensitive to environmental stressors. In humans, pregnancy lasts approximately 9 months, and what happens during the prenatal stage can be predicative of your adult health. For example, my father was born in Midwestern Kansas in the 1940s, and at that time they didn't understand that being exposed to secondhand smoke and things like that can be very detrimental to a developing fetus. And my dad's mother, my grandmother, was exposed to a lot of these environmental factors, and he was actually born very prematurely. He was born at 5 months, and he struggled with issues with his lungs his entire life. So, what happens to you during this prenatal stage can be a predictor of what's going to happen to you later on in life. So this stage involves very rapid growth and development, especially of the brain. Although the development of the brain is somewhat limited in the prenatal, since obviously baby's head still needs to be able to pass comfortably through the pelvic inlet, through the birth canal. Pre-birth stressors can influence the diseases that a person may develop later on in life. The postnatal stage, this is going to be all the way from birth through adolescence. So there's going to be development of the brain. The most rapid period of development of the brain is actually from age 0 all the way through age 6. By age 6, your brain is actually full adult size. Of course, we continue to learn and regions of the brain continue to develop. However, as far as the size go, your brain is full adult size by age 6. Your dentition will develop. Your dentition is your teeth. So you will lose your deciduous or your baby teeth and have your full set of adult teeth, usually by early adolescence, by 12 or 13. Your motor and cognitive skills are developing, and these two are connected. There's been many studies that have shown that children that engage in activities like swimming lessons and other physical activities, that also influences their cognitive growth as well. This term sexual dimorphism, this will keep coming up in the lectures to come. The term sexual dimorphism is referring to differences in overall body size and physical attributes of males and females of the same species. Homo sapiens actually have relatively low levels of sexual dimorphism, meaning that on average, males are not significantly larger than females, especially if you compare us to some of the other great apes like gorillas and orangutans. Male gorillas and male orangutans are about double the size of females. So sexual dimorphism will begin to develop during this stage, and also your skeletal structure as well. All right, so during this phase, you're also extremely influenced by environmental circumstances. So the environmental effects during childhood can influence your growth and development. Depending upon your nutrition and your environmental circumstances, there may be secular trends in height, changes in stature that are influenced by your environment and the nutrition that you receive. Before adulthood, some of these height deficits, meaning if you go through a period of time where nutrition is limited, these height deficits can be recovered through periods of rapid growth and development. So these growth spurts that you go through. All right, so this graph here is just showing you how the body develops. So the brain actually, as far as becoming full adult size, brain is full adult size by age 6. Your dentition, you'll generally have all of your adult teeth by adolescence, by 12 or 13. Your body has more of kind of a steady growth and development. And then the reproductive system develops last. The reproductive system doesn't even really begin to start developing until you hit adolescence. All right. So the adult stage, this is stage 3. So this is all the way from adolescence through death, essentially. Aging and senescence. Aging is referring to the social, cultural, biological events that occur over a lifetime. So the senescence stage is essentially when your body begins to have a more difficult time maintaining homeostasis. So maintaining homeostasis is essentially a state where your organs are operating perfectly, where you're getting adequate nutrition, where you're able to fight off diseases extremely well. So typically when you hear about a new virus or a new flu bug or a coronavirus, you hear about the very young and the very old being affected. The reason that the very old are more affected is because their body is already struggling or is not as capable at maintaining homeostasis from the get-go. Your body's already struggling to maintain proper organ function, and your immune system begins to struggle. So that's why those that are over the age of 60 might be more affected by a new cold bug, new flu bug, or coronavirus, for example. So in females, the cessation or the end of reproduction is called menopause. So for women, you may recall from chapter 3 lecture, menarche is the onset of menstruation. So for females, eggs are held in what's called suspended animation until that female hits puberty. So at adolescence, that's when menarche is onset. That's the onset of menstruation. So for females, reproductive years begin at menstruation and then end at menopause. For males, they begin producing sperm cells at adolescence, and this goes all the way until death. But of course, once they reach the over 60 ages, or really even over 50, there is a reduction in testosterone, and sperm cells are not as fertile as they once were. All right, we're going to go ahead and pause here, and then we will continue on with this in our next recording.